This is Free to Exchange, the show where free-thinking scholars, free markets, and, ironically, free public television all meet. I'm your host, Ben Powell. On today's episode, we're going to explore how and why the role of the United States government has changed over the past 240 years. Then, in the second half of the show, we'll discuss the worldwide spread of free market think tanks and how they are changing the role of governments around the world. My first guest is Dr. Randall Holcomb. Dr. Holcomb is the DeVoe Moore Professor of Economics at Florida State University. His first teaching job out of graduate school was at Texas A&M University, but we won't hold that against him here. He's also the author of the book From Liberty to Democracy, The Transformation of American Government, which is our topic here today. Randy, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Ben. It is great to be here.
So let's start with your book, From Liberty to Democracy. What's the inspiration for the title?
The inspiration for the title, it's almost self-explanatory, but if you were to go back...
For a dumb guy like me, help me out.
Okay. Ben, if we were to go back to 1776 and just grab somebody off the street in the new United States and ask them, tell me in one word, what's the fundamental principle behind American government? That one word would be liberty. The new government was formed to protect the rights of individuals, to protect their liberty. Now, if we were to go grab somebody off the street today and say, tell me in one word, what's the fundamental principle behind American government? That word would be democracy. Right? We're a democracy. Government ought to do what the people want, carry out the will of the majority. And really what the book is about is the historical events that led that transformation from liberty to democracy.
Now, that transformation was actually something the founding fathers were worried about, weren't they? Were they trying to not let us evolve into a democracy with some of the rules they set up?
They were indeed. I mean, they set up a government with checks and balances to try to control the power of government. And the U.S. Constitution established a government of limited and enumerated powers. So according to the Constitution, the government can only do those things that are enumerated in the Constitution, and the powers not given to the federal government in the Constitution are reserved to the states or to the people according to the 10th Amendment. But what we've seen over a couple of centuries is that's really eroded quite a bit, so that now there are virtually no constitutional limits on what the federal government can do.
And even within that system, they were trying to limit the access of the mass population for influencing things, weren't they?
That's true. When the federal government was established, I mean, now we seem to worship on the altar of democracy and think how great it is, government appealing to popular opinion. But when government was formed, it was really, the U.S. government was designed to be 1/6 democratic. And that's the House of Representatives. I mean, if this system of checks and balances is really supposed to work to check the power of government, we have three branches of government. They'd have to be roughly equally powerful to check and balance each other. So the House of Representatives, popularly elected, that was where democracy played its role. The Senate originally was, the senators were chosen by the state legislatures. And so the idea there was, first of all, it insulates them from popular opinion. And the House of Representatives represents the interests of the people. The Senate represents the interests of the state governments. Mm-hmm. Then the courts, well, the justices have always been appointed, again, insulated from popular opinion and democratic pressures. And the president was chosen by an electoral college. And the way the electoral college was originally designed by the founders, it was designed to insulate the choosing of the president from democratic pressures, from popular pressures. The electors, if you look at the Constitution, the electors are chosen by the states, and the Constitution never has said how the states choose their electors. Originally, if you go back to 1800 when Thomas Jefferson was elected, the most common method for choosing electors was that the state legislatures did it. But the Constitution never specified we have democratic elections. Pretty quickly, that evolved so that by the time we get to the 1830s, we have the type of electoral system we have now where citizens voted for who they wanted for president. But the way it was originally designed, the Electoral College was set up essentially to be a search committee. The idea was, we'll pick electors who are better informed than the general public. They know the candidates. They're a search committee. And the way the Constitution was originally set up, the top 5 electoral vote getters Their names would be forwarded to the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives would choose the president. And the founders thought that in the typical election, nobody would get a majority of the electoral votes. And so it would ultimately be the House of Representatives who would choose the president.
So, of course, this isn't how it's worked out now. And we've moved away from these principles of liberty towards democracy. So what are the major bumps along the road in the last 240 years or so where fundamental changes were made that have given way from liberty to democracy?
Yeah, I think we've already focused on one, and that's the popular election of the president. That's not how the founders designed it. There's so many events that we could talk about. One would be the Civil War, where clearly power shifted from the states to the federal government. After the war, an interesting development was that veterans' interests became pretty powerful. After the war, there was a pension bill that was passed for veterans that said if a veteran is injured in battle, that the veteran would receive a pension as long as those injuries kept the veteran as disabled. So this is for disabled veterans who are injured in battle, and the veterans had up to
disabled Union
veterans. Yes, it didn't apply to Confederate veterans because they were considered traitors by the federal government. And so disabled Union veterans, they were injured in battle and disabled. They were entitled to a pension, and they had up to 5 years to claim those pensions. So you would think, since the war ended in 1865, you would think that the pension payments after 1870 would have gone down because everybody who was eligible would have claimed their pensions, and as pensioners either recovered from their disabilities or passed away, we would have lower and lower pension payments. But if you look at the facts, that's not what happened. That those pension payments soared between 1870 and 1890. And the veterans became the first really big interest group that managed to attack the Treasury and get big transfers of income from the Treasury to them. This is sort of the start of big interest group politics in the U.S.
And of course, then we see more of this interest group politics happening as we enter the Progressive era and the Great Depression. What else do you see along the road after the Civil War then as we get to today?
Yeah, well, I mean, the Progressive era is pretty big because there was a change in the way that people were thinking about government in the Progressive era. Prior to the Progressive era, up through the 1800s, people thought the role of government is to protect the rights of individuals, liberty that we talked about before. And that progressive ideology, which really became popular right at the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, that progressive ideology expanded the role of government. Not only did people view that the role of government is to protect their rights, but also to look out for their economic interests. And so that the progressive ideology, that was a big shift. Of course, we had the New Deal, the Great Depression, the two world wars had a big impact on the growth of government, the way people looked at government. But one thing about these events is that government responded to crises that were occurring. And in my book, I say that the ultimate triumph of democracy was Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. And the reason for that is that the Great Society, all these government programs came in not because there was any crisis or any tragedy. You look at the war on poverty, actually poverty had been declining for decades. You look at the health care programs, Medicare and Medicaid that were passed in 1966. Well, actually our health was improving during that period. So these programs weren't in response to any crisis. They were in response to the fact that they were politically popular, that people wanted them. So it was the will of the majority. So that's the ultimate transformation from liberty to democracy finally came in the Great Society, when now we have that vision that the role of government is to carry out the will of the people.
So where can we go from here? What can we do to make things better?
It's a good question. I don't have a good answer for that, but I'll tell you, I've been around long enough. In the 1970s, I was pretty pessimistic because you look at the 70s, we had growing government, we had rising inflation, higher unemployment, we had lines at the gas pump.
And of course, this is coming right on the tails of your story here of when we've made the transition fully to democracy.
That's right, that's right. So the rising unemployment, lines at the gas pump, disco music, leisure suits. It was a decade where you could be pretty pessimistic. But that, then right around the corner, the Reagan Revolution, the Thatcher Revolution, ideology seemed to shift. And then with the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the demise of the Soviet Union in 1991, there's a lot of reason to be optimistic. So it is a little bit disheartening that as we move into the 2000s, we seem to have a reversal on that. I'm optimistic that we can reverse public opinion yet again. Now, I'm a college professor, and so, I think that ideas can be powerful. And so I think what we're teaching our students, what the news media has to say, all of that can have an impact that maybe will turn the course back toward freedom and liberty.
It'll be up to the young people to believe in liberty again versus democracy.
I think so.
Well, thank you so much for joining us here.
I really appreciate the invitation. It's great to be here.
While the United States has been losing its dedication to the principles of liberty, much of the rest of the world is becoming freer. We'll discuss what role free market think tanks have played in that process with our next guest. Stick around.
Free to Exchange is a joint project of Texas Tech's Free Market Institute and Texas Tech Public Media. More information is available at fmi.ttu.edu.
Your favorite PBS shows, ready to watch when you are. Anytime, any place. Find more ways to explore than ever before.
Welcome back. Have you ever noticed this little head on our set? My wife thinks it looks kind of creepy. We keep him here because he was one of the most important economists in the 20th century, Ludwig von Mises. Born in Austria-Hungary in 1881, he studied at and later taught at the University of Vienna. He fled Nazi occupation and eventually ended up becoming a visiting professor at New York University from 1945 until his retirement in 1969. Mises made many important contributions to economic theory. I'll share just two of those with you. In 1920, Mises was the first economist to point out that socialist countries would not be able to rationally plan their economies, even if they were run by angels and the workers were motivated by the good of society. He showed that because socialism abolished private property, that there could be no market for the factory equipment and the raw materials that were used in production. But without a market for those inputs, there would be no meaningful prices for them. Without prices, no one would know how scarce these inputs were, and as a result, would have no idea of how to optimally combine the inputs in order to satisfy the greatest number of people's needs and desires. Mises also contributed to our understanding of business cycles. He argued that when a government expands the money supply, that it will create an unsustainable boom that must eventually bust. He argued that an easy money policy sends the wrong price signals so that people invest in the wrong things and are employed in the wrong sectors. When the boom turns to bust and investments need to be reshuffled, a recession results. Many commentators have used Mises' theory to explain the recent housing boom and subsequent recession in the United States. Each of these important contributions were the subject of great debates within the economics profession in the 1930s. Economists today, who most closely work within the tradition and build upon the work of Ludwig von Mises, are referred to as members of the Austrian School of Economics, in recognition of where that tradition originated. I've certainly learned a lot from Mises and other Austrian economists. So have a number of the guests on this show. So even if my wife thinks he looks creepy, we'll keep Mises here on the set in body, well, sort of, as well as in spirit. Let's get back to the topic of today's show. Joining me now is Dr. Matt Ryan. Dr. Ryan is an associate professor of economics at Duquesne University. He has studied the role that free market think tanks have played in promoting freedom in the United States and around the world. He also happens to be a former student of mine. Matt, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Ben.
So let's start off with free market think tank. What is that? Is there a tank we're sticking people in here and they're all thinking, what do they do?
So when we talk about a free market think tank, we talk about a group that gets together and tries to advance the ideas of classical liberalism, either within their state, if we're talking about the United States, or we're talking about within their country, if we're talking about around the world. But the idea of increasing personal liberty and decreasing the expansion of governments, either within the state or within the country.
So How do they do that? Do they run around lobbying politicians or having rallies? What's the method?
Well, in the United States, they're actually prohibited from actually lobbying governments directly. So what they do in the United States is they do a lot of op-eds, they produce research pieces, they have small conferences, stuff like this. In other countries, actually, they are allowed to lobby the government directly. So depending on where they're at, it depends exactly what sort of action they could take.
Well, let's stick with here in the United States for starters then. So they're not really producing most of the time academic research. It's supposed to be immediately policy relevant, and they communicate it both to legislators and general public?
Sure, absolutely. It could be through op-eds, it could be through public seminars in the evening during the week, absolutely.
So how many of these things are there?
So actually all 50 states in the United States have a state-based free market think tank. There's a few states here there that have two. Here in Texas, they have it's the Texas Public Policy Foundation is what it's called. I'm from Pennsylvania, they have the Commonwealth Foundation.
Yeah, TPPF's a big operation here down in Austin. They have a beautiful new building. In fact, I'm going down there in November, doing one of the think tank things to educate some legislative assistants there on a reading group about what are free markets. But they're not all that big, are they?
No, they're certainly not very. They're not certainly very large. Though together, actually, free market think tanks in the United States collectively, actually, in terms of budgets and the amount of money they spend, actually outweigh the amount of money put forth, soft money, with regards to lobbying.
Really?
They do.
So if they're doing all that, how effective have they been in promoting free markets?
So in the United States, if we look at the effect of state-based free market think tanks on policy, they don't seem to, at this point, have a very large effect on policy. These think tanks have not been around for a very long time, so it may be the case that the window is short. However, they seem to...
Wait a second. Before you go on there, when you say they don't seem to have a big effect, how are you assessing that?
So if we want to look at different policies across different states, we could look at tax rates, whether it's sales tax rates or income tax rates. We could look at the amount of government spending on education or on welfare. We could look at the number of public employees that they have.
And what you're saying is in states that have more free market think tanks, they don't have any lower taxes or lower spending on some of these things?
At this point, it doesn't seem to be the evidence that that's the case. However, they do seem to be having a very large impact on the ideology of individuals within those states. So the idea is perhaps that think tanks have a long-run impact.
Hold on. You're getting ahead of me here. So when you're saying that, you're taking kind of a view from 30,000 feet on that, though,
Sure.
right? So you can't rule out the possibility that some think tanks do actually have an impact.
Absolutely.
So it might be that TPPF goes on a big campaign to lower the state business tax here in Texas and is successful, but that's just one data point among how many hundreds, thousands in what you're studying, right?
Absolutely, certainly. It's the ideology that seems to be having a very large impact on and the mindset of individuals in the country and the growth of liberty around the country. They seem to be having a very strong impact on that.
So the view from 30,000 feet on that is you're picking up systematic differences in what people think in response to think tank activity?
Absolutely, their impact is on what people think, absolutely.
So when we transition from around the United States then, so I mean, that's still hopeful, and
By all means.
They might be influencing people's ideas, which will then influence policy farther down the road.
Absolutely.
And that might be more effective than trying
Absolutely.
to convince government officials.
Absolutely.
But how about the worldwide movement then? When did the worldwide free market think tank movement start happening?
So Sir Anthony Fisher started a group called the Institute for Economic Affairs in 1955. That was the first free market think tank in the United Kingdom. And that was really believed to kind of be a strong underpinning for what Margaret Thatcher was able to achieve in the 1980s. Fisher then came to the United States.
We had free market think tanks in the United States too before that as well. I think 1946, the Foundation for Economic Education.
There were a couple kind of here and there, though the think tank revolution, if you will, really started to happen in earnest in the 90s and 2000s in the United States.
Okay, and around the world, Anthony Fisher founded IEA, then he came to the United States, and what happened?
He founded the Atlas Economic Research Foundation. I believe that was in 1981, and what that foundation does is help further other groups that want to start their own think tanks, both in the United States and around the world.
They're kind of like a resource bank for think tanks or a startup package.
They are, absolutely.
And so have they popped up all over the world?
They have. There's actually over 400 think tanks now around the world in over 80 countries. All 6 populated continents have free market think tanks in them. I believe there's 19 of them in Africa. There's even 11 in the Middle East. There's even a free market think tank in Iraq and Iran.
Wow. So as they've been spreading, I know in the 1970s there were still relatively few, and worldwide it's the 80s and 90s, 2000s we start seeing this, but what's been happening to freedom around the world during this time?
Certainly the world's been becoming more free, and actually if we look at those areas that have free market think tanks around the world, they seem to be actually having a very strong policy impact. They are making the world freer, and when we make the world freer, it makes the world a richer place.
So worldwide trend, we've got the fall of communism. Of course, this is a big increase to economic freedom. To the countries, as we can measure it, there's this index we've talked about on the show before, the economic freedom of the world.
Sure.
I think the countries in that have improved something like 30% since 1980. It's a big improvement. But these think tanks played a role in that, in addition to just kind of this worldwide trend, you think?
They certainly appear to. Certainly those countries that have free market think tanks, and when we measure those think tanks' activities, we seem to see subsequent increases in economic freedom in those countries that have those think tanks.
And so does this paint a bright future that with all of these think tanks in existence now, that the world is going to continue to becoming freer, or has most of the gains been had? What are your observations?
We'd like to think so. I mean, certainly, if there's 400 think tanks in 80 countries around the world, that leaves well over 100 countries left that still don't have free market think tanks in them. And if think tanks can get started and have the same successes that we've seen otherwise, then the world can continue to become a freer and better place.
Well, this jives a lot with kind of the things that we were talking about with our last guest about ultimately, if we're going to reverse the trend from liberty to democracy in the United States, it's got to be about changing the ideas of individuals. And apparently what you're finding is some of these think tanks around the world are starting to impact ideas and even then the policies around the world, if not necessarily the policies in the United States yet.
Absolutely. It seems to be, if it comes down to a war of ideas, if you will, then certainly think tanks are playing a very important role in that.
Is there a corresponding anti-market think tank movement going on in the world?
By fact, there doesn't seem to be a large, if we want to think of it in terms of left-wing and right-wing, there doesn't seem to be a large establishment of left-wing think tanks out there. A lot of people like to say that the left-wing think tanks are the governments themselves.
The governments or possibly the unions?
It's perhaps the flip side. If we want to think of free market think tanks on one side, we could think of the governments on the other.
Well, there certainly are plenty of them around the world that promote their own growth.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for joining us, Dr. Ryan.
Thank you for having me.
On the first half of today's show, we learned about how the United States transitioned from enshrining the principles of liberty to becoming one that's about democracy, where the government should just do whatever it is that the people want it to do. That transition happened with a number of different changes to the electoral rules, series of crises that allow the government to grow. But ultimately, it's been a transformation of the ideals of the American citizens that have allowed it to happen. Most people want the government to do whatever the voters want it to do today. That wasn't true when our country was founded. In the second half of the show, we learned about how think tanks have been influencing opinion around the world in the direction of greater economic freedom. Ultimately, if we're going to get greater freedoms here in the United States, it's going to be an educational effort to talk to the American citizens about the value of liberty. The Free Market Institute here at Texas Tech isn't a free market think tank that tries to influence policy, but we are an educational institute and are hoping to educate students about the principles of liberty and free markets and the general public, including you. Thanks for watching.